Our consumption of energy used to double every 14 years. Now we're slowing down, but not that much. We remain the world's second heaviest users of electricity. Most of the electricity in Canada comes from hydro. A third is from coal and oil. Just under 8% is generated from nuclear power. The nuclear industry in Canada is based on the CANDU reactor, Canadian-designed, advanced technology that makes use of our abundant supplies of uranium. Canada committed itself early to nuclear power to meet future energy needs. But controversy over the social and economic cost of nuclear power has plagued the industry. Critics like Ralph Torrie question the wisdom of our nuclear commitment.
First of all, I don't think it's necessary. We don't need more electricity. Most of our energy needs in this country are for low-temperature heat and for liquid fuels to run our transportation sector. So why build more electricity plants? It's not really what we need. Secondly, considering the fact that it's unnecessary, it becomes very difficult to justify the risks that are involved in producing it.
I think that the public probably hasn't had the debate about nuclear power cast in its proper framework, which is in the total energy availability in this country. When that is done, I'm sure that the average sensible citizen is going to say, well, if the only alternatives to avoid an energy gap and an electricity gap are nuclear and coal, well, let us turn to those alternatives and do so in time to preserve the kind of life that we have now, rather than one that is going to be worse.
You're going to become increasingly dependent on electricity, which is a very vulnerable system. It's distributed across the country through a bunch of wires that are strung together that have to be in exact synchrony. Well, it's going to break down. Blackouts happen because of the vulnerability of electricity, not because of the shortage of fuel supply.
Canada has 8 nuclear power reactors in operation. 16 are under construction. 4 of them are being built at Ontario Hydro's Pickering plant. Yet the industry is in trouble. It isn't getting enough reactor orders to keep it going at full capacity. The nuclear establishment says that unless the industry starts getting more orders, some companies will fold. Then, they argue, Canada might be left without the means to meet future energy needs when electricity demand picks up again.
We wouldn't want to be left in a position where where people went out of business because governments or utilities got cold feet and the industry sought other places to earn money, and we were left in the position where all we had to export were blueprints and brains, and we sort of went the way of the Avro-Arrow.
Nuclear power produces less than 8% of Canada's electricity. The industry believes it will provide a bigger share of that total as the demand for electricity grows. But a recent Ontario report predicts slower growth in electrical demand. That and other problems spell difficulties for the nuclear industry.
A slowdown in nuclear power at this time is justified for many reasons. There's the reason, for instance, of the financing. Could the money be put into other places more profitably from the point of view of job creation and the point of view of energy itself? Secondly, the unsolved problems of waste disposal, of course, one still feels, let's keep this reasonably contained until there are real solutions.
There are waste disposal problems at every stage of the nuclear fuel cycle. Tailings, for example, are the byproduct of the uranium mining operation. Tailing ponds, like those around Elliott Lake, Ontario, emit low-level radioactivity, but critics of the nuclear industry want them covered up. Over the years, the waste from the mining and milling operation have seeped into the Serpent River system, running from the Elliott Lake area 50 miles south to Georgian Bay. Some cleanup work is underway, but the river is still contaminated. Radium levels are above provincial standards of acceptability.
nuclear energy advertises itself as being clean. If it wants to live up to that promise, then it must dispose of these wastes and not allow them to get into the river systems and contaminate lakes and rivers. If they're going to do that, it's going to add to the cost of nuclear electricity.
Edwards says there's no safe level of radiation, no matter how low. He claims that long-term exposure to even the low-level radioactivity at Elliott Lake can cause cancer. There's mounting pressure on the mining companies to contain the problem.
We have underway very important tailings restoration systems, so that when the mining operations cease, in Elliott Lake, for example, in the year 2020, that the tailings will be restored in such a way that they will not represent a hazard to future generations. The most likely method that will be used is a form of covering and vegetation, again, to contain the material so that it does not enter the ecosystem in general.
A recent Saskatchewan inquiry has gone even further. It recommends that tailings be sealed in underground concrete vaults, covered with earth and then covered again with asphalt. That will add even more to the cost of nuclear power. Problems of cost and waste disposal bedevil the industry. More than any other energy producer, the nuclear industry is under critical scrutiny at every stage of its operating cycle. The spent fuel bundles of uranium that fuel the reactor are stored underwater when they're used up. Water in the storage bays cools the hot bundles and provides a shield against any seepage of radioactivity. The bays at Pickering are filling up faster than expected. The bundles will remain radioactive for thousands of years, and the industry has yet to find a proven way to dispose of them permanently. Ontario's Porter Commission suggested we might want to stop building more reactors if there's no proved waste disposal solution by 1985. The nuclear critics want a moratorium now.
We're not asking to shut down the operating reactors, but we're saying that let's go slow on nuclear expansion until we know that the waste problem can be solved. It's far from solved at the present time. They're only beginning to scratch the surface, as it were.
That kind of criticism angers an industry that's been working on the waste problem for years. At the AECL White Shell Research Facility in Manitoba, millions of dollars are spent every year to find solutions. In one experiment, spent fuel bundles were encased in above-ground concrete tombs. If that works, they'll be buried underground. 20 years ago, 24 pieces of radioactive glass, similar to this demonstration model, were buried at Chalk River, Ontario. One of the pieces has been exhumed and shipped to the White Shell Lab for analysis. It's an experiment to test one method of disposing of liquid waste. The radioactive liquid is mixed with glass, covered with concrete, and surrounded with lead shielding for burial. The industry believes it can safely bury radioactive waste in geologically stable formations like the Canadian Shield. Research crews are checking out possible locations in the shield for a central disposal site.
I think I can say with a high level of confidence that whatever method we finally recommend for permanent disposal will be safe as human ingenuity can make it.
But how much will all this cost? AECL has spent more than $2 billion over the past 20 years on research, much of it at the Chalk River site. The critics suggest electricity from nuclear power wouldn't look so cheap if that sum had been added directly to our utility bills. Also not added in, say the critics, are a whole lot of other costs. The cost of future research, of eventual waste disposal methods, of the AECL bureaucracy. And there's no way of knowing how high future costs could go. Nuclear reactors have a limited lifetime, 30 to 50 years. Then they have to be decommissioned. Dismantling could cost anywhere from $30 to $100 million per reactor.
The nuclear industry has been very good at telling us how much it costs to do something that it's already done. But how can it tell us what it's going to cost to dispose of the waste, or to decommission a reactor and take it apart and dispose of it? These costs are unknown. They're not charged to the consumer, but somewhere in the future, someone's going to have to pay for them.
I just say it's a falsehood that they're uttering, because if you add them in, your waste management program is worth about 1% of the cost of power.
Decommissioning?
Decommissioning, the same, if anything.
How far are we willing to go with nuclear power? Is it a transition energy source to fill the gap? Or should we commit ourselves more deeply? In Europe, Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium have made that decision. They've taken the next nuclear step, reprocessing. They send their used uranium in heavily shielded containers to a central plant to be reprocessed into new fuel. In very simplified terms, reprocessing produces new reactor fuel from the original uranium that's been used up. The Europeans have turned to reprocessing because they don't have the uranium supplies we do. In the reprocessing cycle, the spent uranium bundles are cut into small pieces and dissolved in nitric acid to create the new reactor fuel, plutonium. But the highly radioactive liquid waste that results from this operation pose a further disposal problem for the industry. The plutonium itself is a problem. It's the main ingredient in the making of nuclear weapons. That, say the critics, increases the risk of nuclear proliferation. For the critics, once you get into reprocessing, there's no turning back.
As you, step by step, make more and more commitments to the nuclear future, we will almost be forced 20 years from now to make a commitment to reprocessing. And eventually you foreclose the option of going to a renewable energy society. It's a myth that you can use nuclear power to build a bridge to a renewable energy society. If you go the nuclear route, gradually you foreclose your other options. It's essentially a one-way ticket to doomsday.
The Canadian nuclear establishment believes reprocessing is inevitable. They say it's the guarantee of an energy-sufficient future when the uranium runs out. But reprocessing in Canada is still years away.
We are doing very little about reprocessing at this time. The Government of Canada has decided to wait for the outcome of the International Fuel Cycle Evaluation program that's underway now, a 2-year program involving about 53 countries, before it decides whether to proceed towards commercialization of reprocessing or not.
Critics also question the social and economic costs of the nuclear option.
They have a whole department that does nothing but build pumps and pump seals and test them and check them. And
should we reduce our reliance on big centralized energy systems? Should we keep a faltering nuclear industry going with continued heavy government support? The debate between the two sides is frequently ideological.
Over a period of about 10 years.
I think the critics are out to, not to find out facts about nuclear power, but to stop nuclear power.
I think a certain group of people are using nuclear energy as a vehicle for advocating social change, advocating a type of society that I'm not necessarily sure that everyone is willing to accept.
I think the nuclear industry is somewhat paranoid. They have a reaction ranging from defensive to what one might describe as a siege mentality.
They don't like the kind of society that relies upon energy sufficiency, and they know that the sources of power for the last decade of this century are going to be very limited.
I don't think we want to go back to a lifestyle where our whole day is consumed in ensuring that we gather enough wood to heat our homes.
What you have to do is look at the nuclear future and look at the social problems that will come with it. Some of them are already coming. And look at the renewable energy future and the problems that will come with that and make your choice. But don't try and tell me that one path has social problems and the other doesn't, or one path has social change involved with it and the other doesn't. I mean, anyone who's ever read a history book knows that social change is something which accompanies a change in the energy system.
The debate about our energy future is as much about values as about technology. The decisions we make about energy, perhaps more than any others, will influence the kind of life future generations will enjoy. These decisions will not be felt for 10, perhaps 20 years. Energy lead times are long. It takes years to develop new forms of energy and ways to bring them to the consumer. Fossil fuels will eventually run out. The world of tomorrow, the world of the 21st century, will have to rely on renewable sources of energy. The only question is when. By the year 2000, 2020, 2050. We must develop new sources of energy now if we are to have alternatives when we need them. In the meantime, our choices are limited.